It's interesting, Mick, when you say in the post-COVID environment, because this podcast was born basically out of the changing circumstances of COVID. And we're seeing so many knock-on effects with COVID. And it's interesting when I think of just one key stat, when you're just describing what Eddie was telling you very early in the piece, and I love oracles of the industry that can pick it in advance, because he's spot on. Buyer's remorse has been around forever, but the issue is you've accelerated the amount of buyer's remorse because you ratcheted up the price point for everybody. So there was this whole need for mobility. And it's interesting that the stat that still stands out for me, we talked about it in one of our previous podcasts, where the Australian car park went from 19.7 million to 21.4 million from pre-COVID to now. In fact, I think I'm waiting for the data to come out this year. I think it's going to be even more than 21.4. So there's a million extra cars on the road. And the average age of the car park increased by year. So it's actually 11.3 versus 10.4. Hello and welcome. Today we've got Mick McKenna from the VACC, who will share insights into his role as an industry policy advisor.
Yeah, it's a great topic and something that impacts everybody in the industry. So let's jump into it.
So you've got older cars that are a higher price, that have done more Ks, and aren't necessarily in the great condition, because the industry, for some reason, we've always fixated on how many new cars being sold, and we think that the EV car park right now must be huge. Well, I think we've cracked 100,000 actual EVs on the road, as in sole EVs. There's 400,000 hybrids, but there's 21 million cars. So we're still a drop in the ocean.
And when you see something have 237% growth or a skewed figure like that, you know you're starting from a low baseline.
Yes.
So yeah, absolutely. But now, having said that, let me put this note on there and citation. I drive an electric vehicle, so I love it. But again, stats are stats and reality is reality. But anyway, you're right. It's always good to speak to people like Ed and Paul O'Halloran, these type of guys in Victoria who know what's going on. And the guys out at Rob McDonald and all these guys out at the auction places, because they know what's going on. They've seen it before.
With 30 years experience in auto logistics and state-of-the-art locations in 5 major Australian cities, Precar Fleet Services are a premier all-in-one solutions provider for commercial vehicle fleet operators, leasing companies and original equipment manufacturers. Please visit precar.com.au and click on the link to Fleet Services.
We're saying now with Moody's Analytics pushing out that they're expecting a drop from anywhere between 10 to 22% in used car market prices and so on. And as I was talking to John about the other day, as we know that the used car department is usually the most profitable centre within a franchise dealer setup. The dealers now, and with the transition to ZEV technology, need to be able to compete on equal terms with the aftermarket. So we're asking the government to get rid of the motor vehicle duty that's applicable on aftermarket parts and accessories to a new car that increases its dutiable value. We know that, for instance, like the Repcos, what is the GDP brands, whatever they turn over $23 billion a year. ARB had an after-tax profit of $88 million in Australia last year. These aren't small entities now anymore. And they've got the whole access to repair information. The government's made a sensible decision to allow the right people to have the access to the right information that they need to be able to complete the job. Now you've actually slanted the competition the other way, and the aftermarket has a distinct advantage now, an even greater advantage with the access to repair information, which we're trading on the same circumstances, except our price is greater because we've got to apply motor vehicle duty to it. So the customer's just going to vote with their feet and drive across the road, put the tow bar on instead of doing it at the dealership.
It's interesting because stamp duty was a winner for houses because houses went up, so they were getting more stamp duty from it. Car sales goes up, and the value of the car goes up, therefore they can make more stamp duty. Because remember, John, we were talking when we spoke with Ben Sullivan about the dollars are in the data, and the average price of a new car went from 35 grand up to 50 grand as soon as COVID hit. So that was just new cars. So obviously used cars moved up in proportion to that too. So that 15 grand is an extra stamp duty that the government would be getting. So if the used car prices start sinking, even though the volumes hypothetically will be the same, say, use a national number, say there's 2.5 million used cars sold a year, round figures. So though the average price will drop versus, say, last year or the year before, the volumes hypothetically will be the same, but the revenue actually is reduced from that because the capital value has dropped. So these are the funny little idiosyncrasies. You need what was the old Murphy model that they used to have for the Australian economy, that you plug a variable in here and it spat out a number down here as this is the final figure, and GDP equaled this. And
Well, it depends which economist or which professional service firm you prefer to listen to on what formulas they've got in their Excel spreadsheet. We've been lucky for 7 years. We've staved off rises to motor vehicle duty in Victoria. I'm hoping for 8, but I'm not optimistic at all. Again, based upon what we read and what we see and the forward estimates that they've put into the Victorian budget, if you read what's online, they're not going to meet those targets. And there's a big problem arising somewhere. So the good times are certainly wound back, and I think the government's going to come knocking. We'll do what we can, and where arguments are strong, but it doesn't matter. I don't think any industry, even the builders or the dog groomers, are not going to be getting much in the next couple of years in this state, regardless of what colour the government is. It's just nothing there.
Yeah, because it's also the duty around electric vehicles, because they're going to lose their excise on the fuel. And how do they recover that?
You're so right, and that's a really big issue that we're going to have to contend with. Again, this is something that the EV lobby groups really need to be a little bit more clearer in their communications. At the moment, right now, we don't have any of those road user taxes or so on applicable. So it's a free drive. However, the feds aren't going to muck around. They're going to get it right. At the moment, they're missing out on 100,000 vehicles, as Mark was saying before. 100,000 vehicles are not paying anything to contribute to the roads, in effect. That's what we're saying. That's going to stop. And that's a factor. That's a cost on top of that vehicle. They might get parity on price, and we're looking forward to that in the next 5 to 10 years, if it does so eventuate. But again, as I digress away from that point, not everybody wants to drive a Dolphin. Our market says we want to drive a Ranger, we want to drive a BT50, and you try to change a whole country into driving a BYD or a Tesla. So that whole thing about taxes is the reality. It's going to be a further impost on the cost of living for people. I reckon I'm one of the few in Sunbury who's driving, and I can tell you, mate, an extra $400 a year, and when I have to come to pay that in road user tax, will hurt me and what I do for a month or two. So you've picked up a really good point there. It's going to come, and that's probably the thing that has really been missed in the whole fuel efficiency stuff as well. What's going to happen there? Within the fuel efficiency stuff as well, we're seeing very little incentive or no incentive for the purchase of these things or for dealers to sell them. And in fact, if I be brutally honest, the governments haven't even really treated the retail sector with much respect when it comes to talking about the transition at all.
Quite interested, the government paper on emissions. Part of what they said, they're just going to look at tail emissions, and they're not going to look at the manufacture of the car. And I think that's giving the EV a free ride, because the big problem with EV is the mining of the minerals and the effect of that. And the second part of that is the recycling of the battery at the end of life. But I don't think those issues have been quite resolved yet. Some people say that they're starting to get in recycling of batteries, but I'm not convinced on that. So that'll be an interesting discussion.
Keeping in mind that the paper that was released was an impact analysis that's got to be responded to by industry and a few others. But we believe the government's going, as I think I said in my communication to the industry, we believe they're going down the option B line, which is a US model. If you'd really like to have an in-depth conversation on this panel with it, I think Matt Hobbs is probably the best bloke to speak to, because he's now got a really good understanding from the manufacturer's perspective. That's where he's come from. And he's had time now to get a really good understanding of where we are at as a retail thing. And he's pretty forthright as well, Matt. So I think that him and Dr. Reid are both good on it. So you might even want to have both of them on. But I think they would have some really good things to say. I can tell you the first for information from the dealership cohort has been massive, because I spoke to one dealer today who owns Toyota, Hyundai and Mazda, and they haven't heard a word from any of them about Sunday's announcement, which I thought was amazing, because they haven't told the people who have invested in their brand a thing. Now, these guys, for all intents and purposes, in 10 months' time, that legislation becomes live. These guys need to plan, they need to forward order, they need to do all these things. And so, again, that's why we see they're looking to someone for leadership. Well, here we are. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Look forward to hearing from you again.
Well, thank you for listening. Hopefully you got as much out of the podcast conversation with Mick as we did.